Thank you, John. In recent days, Israel has been attacked and has been compelled to take action to defend itself from attacks from Gaza. This is the third time in 6 years. Once again, voices have been raised criticizing these military operations and demonizing Israel for acts of self-defense that will be no-brainers for just about any other country in the world. This is a sad and tragic time, especially for the more than 1.7 million Palestinians who essentially have been taken hostage by Hamas in its efforts to advance its radical agenda. We're fortunate to have with us today Joshua Muravchik, whose book, Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel, seems particularly relevant to current events. Dr. Muravchik has written hundreds of articles in major U.S. newspapers and intellectual journals on a wide variety of foreign policy, political, and ideological topics. He's the author of 9 previous books, including Heaven on Earth, The Rise and Fall of Socialism, Exporting Democracy, Fulfilling America's Destiny, and Trailblazers of the Arab Spring, Voices of Democracy in the Middle East. He's currently a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. For many years, he was at the American Enterprise Institute. From 2011 to 2013, he was also a fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. He was a fellow in residence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and before that, back in the 1970s, he was a congressional aide to Representative James O'Hara and to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Joshua?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for coming here to hear what I have to say. I'm grateful for that. And it is certainly a striking coincidence that a process that we've watched repeat itself many times over the past decade and a half is now taking place once again, in which Israel is attacked, it strikes back in self-defense, and then it receives widespread criticism around the world and from various quarters in the United States and in the media. And this was a subject that I tackled in this book. Why does it work this way? And the idea for the book came to me about 4 or 5 years ago, one morning when I read in the paper or on the internet about a story in a newspaper in Sweden. It was a story that ran in the Swedish daily Aftonbladet, which is the widest circulation daily in Sweden. And the story reported that Israelis were now slaughtering Palestinians randomly in order to harvest their body organs for sale. The story, need I say, had no basis whatsoever. It was built around the case of a single deceased Palestinian who had a scar on his body because he had been autopsied. But when reporters for other publications followed up the Aftonbladet story and went to this man's family, they denied having ever made such an accusation to Aftonbladet. In other words, the Swedish reporter had essentially made this up out of whole cloth. The Swedish ambassador to Israel apologized for the story, at which point she was reprimanded and forced by the Swedish Foreign Ministry to withdraw her apology on the grounds that it was an infringement on press freedom. Well, when I read about this that morning 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, how can this be? This is so crazy. How did we come to this? I can understand that people feel critical of Israel at one moment or another, disagree with Israeli policies. Sure, fair game. Who doesn't? I do sometimes. But to have an image of Israel in which you could imagine and put in print writers and editors in a major Western daily newspaper that Israelis were randomly slaughtering Palestinians to harvest their organs. How did we come to a point where people had an image of Israel that would allow them to think and write and publish such things? And it was also startling to me because I'm old enough to remember 40 years earlier, the time of the Six-Day War, a time when the support for and sympathy for Israel around the world was very, very substantial. Public opinion polls showed that in the United States, perhaps half people did not have an opinion or didn't care or didn't know about it, but of the half who did, the support for Israel versus support for the Arabs was quite overwhelming. I don't remember exactly, it's about 8-1, something like that. But what is interesting is that similar polls were taken in Britain and France, and the ratio of support for Israel was even more one-sided than it was in the United States. In the United States, there's still a great deal of support for Israel, but around the world, it's completely evaporated. And so I set out to write this book to ask myself the question, what it was that had brought about this dramatic change. I can't think of any case in history in which a country which had not undergone a revolution and a complete change of its political regime was the subject of such a complete reversal in the way the outside world regarded that country. And as I studied it, I thought of or learned about certain things. Well, first, the obvious things. Israel's triumph in the 1967 war changed many things. For one thing, Israel never again was to seem as threatened as it did on the eve of that war, when the Arab armies were mobilized on its borders and the Arab rulers were declaring quite plainly their intention to eliminate Israel once and for all. And Israel, after that, was to seem not so vulnerable and very strong. But there were also, I think, more subtle processes that took place. One was the death of Pan-Arabism. To that moment, the leading figure in the Arab world was President Nasser of Egypt, and the leading idea was the idea that he was the great exponent of, and that was Pan-Arabism. If you look back, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded in 1964 at the behest of Nasser. And it was not the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it was the Palestine Liberation Organization, because it was not formed with any thought of creating an independent Palestine. The point was simply to liberate Palestine from the Jews so that it could become part of this omnibus Arab state that Nasser espoused. If you look at the Palestinian National Charter, which was adopted in 1964, it makes no mention of having a Palestinian state or of sovereignty for the Palestinians. It is all about the Palestinians as part of the Arab nation. But the defeat of the Arabs in 1967 was so devastating and so humiliating that it destroyed Nasser's prestige. And with this destruction of Nasser's prestige, it also destroyed the idea of Pan-Arabism. And that, in turn, cleared the field for the emergence in the next years of Palestinian nationalism. And Palestinian nationalism had been advocated by a few Palestinians, among them Yasser Arafat and some of his friends who were mostly working in Kuwait, and that was their own headquarters, and they had formed Fatah. And over the years after 1967, they